Hello YouTube, and welcome to another episode of Raw History. This week, the samurai, and the role that they played in over 1,000 years of Japanese history. So we're going to look at the 7 main periods or eras in Japan in which the samurai were active and kicking ass. And we'll also look at some of the conflict and civil wars which the samurai participated in. If I have to sum up this video in one sentence, it's Game of Thrones, but with samurai. So yeah, it'll be fun. So really, up until the end of World War II in 1945, Japanese history has been characterised by a lot of renewal, and then destruction, and then renewal, and then destruction, and then renewal, and then destruction. And this impermanence is really key to the Japanese national psyche. The 7 eras, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, are defined by a constant power shift between the emperor and feudal lords, and back and forth over and over and over again. When an emperor ruled Japan, we're talking about Imperial Japan, and when these feudal lords ruled Japan, it's referred to as a shogunate. Now what I mean by feudal lord is kind of hard to understand because the term feudalism itself is fairly tricky to pin down. It's most commonly used by historians in regards to medieval Europe, but in Japan it refers to a slightly different system that's based entirely around military service. So as I've said, the type of person ruling Japan changed an awful lot, but the system of rule stayed pretty consistent. The supreme leader, whether it be a shogun or an emperor, gave out huge amounts of land to these very powerful and noble, but often competing families. Exactly like in Game of Thrones. The Japanese word for this powerful class of noble families is Daimyō, which literally means private landowners. This land was worked by the peasants, who really did get the raw end of the deal because they had to pay taxes, which was almost always in the form of rice, to their daimyo, as thanks for being allowed to do their back-breaking work on the daimyo's land. Rice really was the currency of medieval Japan, and the most powerful daimyo were the ones that could produce the most rice from their lands. So anyway, the peasants pay the great daimyo families for the land in rice, and the great daimyo families pay their shogun or the emperor for the land by providing a certain number of fighting men for the military. And this brings us to the samurai. I may have made it sound quite complicated with all the Japanese words, but it really is a very simple hierarchy with either the shogun or the emperor at the top, and then the daimyo, and then the samurai, and then as always the peasants at the bottom. However, every so often one of these powerful daimyo families would not feel comfortable living on the second highest rung of the ladder, and so they would overthrow the emperor, and the most powerful military leader of that daimyo would declare himself the new shogun. A few years later, another rival family would decide that they had a better claim to the figurative Iron Throne, and so they would overthrow the shogun and reinstate an emperor, and it goes on and on and on and on and on and on. But the people fighting all these battles were the samurai. So the samurai were a warrior class of tough guys, and just as daimyo is the Japanese word for the noble houses, bushi is the name of this warrior class. So these bushi samurai rode around their daimyo's lands, keeping them safe and maintaining law and order and protecting the people and peasants from local bandits. Whenever a war would inevitably break out between the powerful families, the samurai were all rounded up by their local daimyo and sent off to fight for whichever side that family was aligned with. Just like in Game of Thrones. In fact, the word samurai means those who serve the nobility. And so they were really kind of just super overqualified policemen slash hired soldiers slash medieval knights. However, although it can be argued that the samurai were just muscle for money, they didn't act like how we would imagine hired goons or mercenaries to act in the Western world. They were bound by a very, very strict code of honor known as Bushido, which literally means the way of the warrior. However, Bushido is a fairly modern term that would not have been used 1,000 years ago. The core principles of Bushido are moral values such as humility, loyalty to the death, patience, mastery of martial arts, and a crazy amount of honor. Honor to such an extent that suicide was seen as preferable to anything that might bring about dishonor, like surrender. The famous method used by samurai to kill themselves is known as seppuku, and it refers to plunging a short blade into the abdomen and jiggling it around from left to right until you died. The term harakiri is also sometimes used, but seppuku is the word that would have been used by the samurai themselves. Seppuku was also very much a ritual that would be performed publicly, and unless it was performed on the battlefield to avoid capture, it often required the permission of the samurai's daimyo. In fact, a daimyo could even demand that their samurai commit seppuku, and they often did this as part of a peace settlement at the end of a long and bloody conflict. There was also a similar ritual suicide that could be carried out by samurai's wives, and they would often do this either if their husband had died or if he had brought about some kind of dishonor, and they would also do it to avoid capture or rape if they knew that defeat was inevitable. But all this talk of suicide is depressing, so let's talk about something way more exciting: killing other people. I mentioned earlier the 7 eras in which the samurai were active, and I don't have time to go into detail on all of them, but I can give you a quick overview. So we start off in 794 ACE with the Heian era in Japan, which is where feudal medieval Japan and the samurai as we know them all began. The reason that the Heian period begins in 794 is that is when the Emperor Kanmu decided to move the capital of Japan from the ancient city of Nara to a new city called Heian-kyo, which is now much better known as Kyoto. So, although technically Kanmu and his descendants were the emperors of Japan for almost 400 years, true power lay with the Fujiwara clan, who were an incredibly old and powerful aristocratic daimyo that often married Fujiwara women with young emperors, and this means that most of the imperial line was mothered by women of the Fujiwara daimyo. Now, if the idea of kings being manipulated by a super wealthy, powerful family sounds familiar, that's because it is. So when the Fujiwara clan weren't conquering Westeros, I mean Japan, the Heian era must have been actually a pretty nice time to be alive in. The samurai kept the people relatively safe, and there was an awful lot of culture and stability in that 400-year dynasty. In fact, in 1021, a writer called Murasaki Shikibu wrote what is thought to be the first ever novel. It was called Genji Monogatari, which means the tale of Genji. And what's cool about Murasaki Shikibu is that she was a woman. This means that the pioneer of all literature and the forerunner of great men like Hemingway and Dickens and Tolstoy was actually a Japanese woman. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Buddhism also began to spread like wildfire in this era, and it merged with the local Shinto religion that was native to Japan. Shinto was centered around the worship of literally thousands and thousands of gods, but unlike most modern religions, including Buddhism, it wasn't so much teaching-based as it was action and ritual and mythology-based. Okay, but moving very quickly on, because not everything was sunshine and rainbows in the Heian era, and in 1185, following the Genpei War, everything fell apart when the Fujiwara clan and the imperial dynasty was overthrown by an incredibly powerful warlord named Yoritomo of the Minamoto daimyo, and he declared himself the first ever shogun of Japan. I should also point out that the people fighting in the Genpei War were our old friends, the samurai. So in 1185, the Heian era was in tatters, and the military leader, or shogun Yoritomo, declared the Kamakura period, where power lay with him and his progeny of warlord shoguns, and not with the imperial dynasty. Although I should point out that the imperial dynasty did continue in this time, and they were still seen as like the figurehead, but much like the Japanese imperial dynasty of today, or the British royal family, they had absolutely no real power. But as I said at the beginning of this video, Japanese history is characterized by restoration and also destruction, and in 1274 the Kamakura period came crashing down thanks to an attempted invasion from the Mongols. I feel like any 13th century civilization was affected by the Mongols. Those guys screwed up a lot of people's plans. But the Mongols were especially traumatic for Japan, and the only reason that Japan survived in this period was a kamikaze. No, not that kamikaze. That kind of kamikaze wouldn't appear for many hundreds of years later. But the word kamikaze is actually a Japanese word meaning divine wind. And it was a massive hurricane that actually turned away the Mongol invaders. Although this natural typhoon did save Japan from a hostile takeover, it wasn't enough to save the Kamakura era, and in 1333 the shogunate was overthrown in a pure Targaryen-style coup. Immediately, a powerful new player called Go-Daigo declared himself the new emperor in what is known as the Kemu Restoration. However, this great and glorious new era did not last long, and only 4 years later in 1337, Emperor Go-Daigo was overthrown by a new shogun, and this led to the incredibly violent Muromachi period. And so it was in this period that the samurai were at their most prestigious and their most powerful, and I guess that's because, like all soldiers, they needed war to have any kind of purpose. However, in pure Japanese style, even the era of destruction was finally destroyed, and in 1603 the fighting finally stopped as the super strong Tokugawa shogunate took power. Now this period is known as the Edo period because the capital of Japan was moved from Kyoto to a new small town called Edo. That small town called Edo is now more commonly known as Tokyo, and it is the largest city in the world. So, due to the absurdity that had come before, the Tokugawa shogunate decreed that there would be no more wars and that everyone just had to accept their lot in life. However, in 1868, the last shogun was also overthrown, and the rule of Japan finally returned to an emperor. And so this led to the seventh and final era of the samurais, known as the Meiji era. And the Meiji era lasted until Japan's defeat at the end of World War II in 1945. However, unlike in the violent days of the Muromachi period, in the 7th era the samurai's prestige had waned greatly, and by 1873 Emperor Meiji finally overturned the law that stated the samurai could be the only armed forces in Japan. Instead, soldiers were conscripted from all walks of life, and the Japanese army began to look a lot more like the national armies of Europe or America. Most of the surviving samurai worked as mercenaries, masterless and without a daimyo. For these wandering samurai, known as ronin, they must have looked back fondly on the days of the Heian era, when the Bushi class of warriors represented the absolute might of Japan. So I just want to finish up by talking about one specific samurai called Tomoe Gozen. Tomoe is unusual, although not unique among samurai, as she was in fact a woman, known as an Onabu geisha, or warrior woman. Tomoe fought alongside Yoritomo, who, if you remember, he was the first shogun of Japan and the man that won the Genpei War, which overthrew the Fujiwara clan in the entire Heian era. In the battle, Tomoe is described as being a remarkably strong archer and a swordswoman. She was a warrior worth 1,000, ready to confront a demon or a god, and she performed more deeds of valor than any other warrior. However, Tomoe is not alone. Yoritomo's own wife, a woman called Hojo Masako, fought with Tomoe in the same battle, and on the other side fought another woman called Hangaku, who commanded 3,000 men and survived an attack against 10,000 enemy soldiers. Although what we are often presented with in films and textbooks is the idea of a samurai as a great and noble, honor-bound man who wandered the countryside fighting bandits and protecting the innocent in the name of truth and justice, the reality is a lot more interesting than that. The samurai only made up 10% of Japanese society, yet their teachings can still be found today, and they captured not just Japan's imagination, but the entire world's. So that's all I have time for, I'm afraid, but if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss any more future Raw History videos. And this week's head scratcher is, why doesn't Tarzan ever have a beard? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.